I'm from a small working class town in central Massachusetts called Fitchburg. Um, my dad owned a bar. A lot of people in my family had like landscaping companies. Fitchburg is that kind of town. Like there's a lot of like construction work, building homes, maintaining homes, things like that. I did landscaping, every summer through high school, so I was pretty sure I was just going to be a landscaper. And that was fine with me. I liked doing that work. At the time, I loved my hometown. My relationship as with my hometown has changed a little bit since. But what the military offered me at that time was just like I could just go have some adventures before I settled down, started a landscaping company, and then for the rest of my life, kind of, spent my life in Fitchburg, Massachusetts. So as an 18-year-old kid, there was, a war that was just starting. And to me, like it was an opportunity. I didn't see it as like a duty that I had to defend my country. Like, yes, it was those things, but like at 18 years old, the things that were like prominent in my mind was like going off, having this adventure, and then coming back and getting the esteem that veterans get. Um, we have a particular culture about the military here in the United States, and you might not even be aware of it unless you've like traveled and lived in other places. I've spent a few years, I have family in Italy. I've spent a few years out there, different culture with regards to the military. Like it's not like something special to be a soldier over there. People don't bend over backwards to like, buy you a beer any chance they get or shake your hand or anything like that. It's just like, just an ordinary job. Um, but here, if you're a veteran, you are automatically thought of as a hero. And the strange part of that is it doesn't even matter what the war was about, whether it was a just war or unjust war. If you're a veteran, you are considered a hero, and people will thank you for your service. And, that's the treatment that I wanted. I wanted to come back, from my military experience, start my life in my hometown, and just, men would respect me, women would like me, I'd get free beers anytime I'd walk into a bar. People, shake my hand every time I walk down the street. It was that kind of regard and esteem that I was ultimately looking for. Now, I was probably, I think, a sophomore or a junior at the time of the attacks of 9/11. So I knew we were entering to this major new global war. Um, I was in high school. I got to be honest, I wasn't paying really close attention to the news. I didn't understand all the justifications for why we were doing what we were doing. Like there was some vague connection with the attackers in Afghanistan. So we started a war with Afghanistan. That didn't seem strange to me at the time. Now, years later, as I've researched this a bit, I could, point some things out to you about that you probably haven't considered, things that might have if I had known it then, might have given me pause about what we were doing. Um, but in some sense, it didn't really matter, because I believed a lot of the things we believe about the military, that, we fight for freedom and democracy, that our soldiers are heroes, and it just kind of wasn't conceivable to me that we might have been fighting for the wrong reasons, or that by making this decision to join the military and possibly go off to war somewhere, that I wouldn't be doing something heroic. Um, so I just had all these background assumptions about what we were doing. Things just like gleaned from years of like, watching movies, overhearing, chatter on the news about foreign policy. I didn't make an effort to fact check anything. I never once considered what this might mean for the people on whatever battlefield I would end up getting sent to. I was just thinking about what this meant for me and how this would advance my career objectives, make me this local hometown war hero, make all my friends around town respect me and like me, all that kind of stuff. And then in the meantime, I get to go off and have these adventures on some, exotic battlefield somewhere. At 18 years old, that's what I was thinking about. And it feels like a very selfish, irresponsible decision now, looking back on it. Um, but nonetheless, I did that. I went to boot camp June of 2003, and I was really worried that the war was already wrapping up as I was entering the military because we invaded Iraq March 19th of 2003. Um, I was still in my senior year at that time. A couple weeks later, once I graduated, went to boot camp 2 weeks later, and I was worried the war was already over and that I was going to miss it. 3 months of boot camp and then 2 more months of infantry school. So by January, I went into a unit that was deployable. I was stationed in Camp Lejeune, North Carolina. It looked like, we were just getting clips of the news. We didn't have access to any kind of like special intelligence. We were just seeing all the same news that you get that any American would have been seeing. It looked like the fighting was picking up again in Iraq. And it was being reported that these were either criminals or just anti-Americans or, people who were loyal to the old regime in Iraq. It wasn't really clear why they were fighting against us, just like vague motives. It wasn't being reported particularly well. Um, so the picture being presented to us was that we had liberated Iraq from this awful dictator. And it's true, Saddam Hussein was an awful dictator, but we can quibble with this whole liberation story later. Um, but that's what was being presented to us. So I'm still, training in the military, thinking that, okay, I might still get this war experience. And it looks like, by all appearances, that this is not something that I really need to ask questions about. By the time I got to our fleet unit, once you're in the fleet, you're deployable. It was 1st Battalion, 8th Marines, stationed at Camp Lejeune. And we started doing counterinsurgency training in preparation for a coming deployment. Are you guys familiar with what counterinsurgency is, how it might differ from other forms of warfare? I see some nods, some heads shaking. So consider, like traditional total war is like kind of iconic World War II battles where you have like tanks on the battlefield, air support above, and battlefields mostly void of civilians, right? So you don't really have to think too much about civilian casualties. Counterinsurgency is fought in a different kind of context where a lot of the fighting is taking place in residential neighborhoods because there are different goals. Like in traditional warfare, you're capturing territory. You're trying to take this piece of land from the enemy, and once they have no land left, you've won the war. Counterinsurgency is different. You're not trying to capture territory. Arguably, you're trying to capture the political loyalties of a population. So you're going out to villages and like we were like passing out like Tootsie Rolls to little kids and candy, trying to present ourselves as this like helpful, friendly neighbor while bringing like a security presence to these villages. Most of the time, though, you end up actually attracting violence to the villages or, the neighborhoods that you're working in. Violence usually has a way of finding you, and then all that fighting is happening right there in residential neighborhoods. So counterinsurgency warfare is typically associated with high levels of civilian casualties, and it's also associated with soldiers having to make really difficult decisions about who's a civilian, who's not a civilian, where are the threats coming from, and then trying to make combat decisions that, you know, kill the enemy, defend yourself, but also without injuring any civilians. And mistakes are made all the time. It's a really difficult kind of fighting for soldiers. They end up making a lot of decisions that they end up regretting their entire lives. Sometimes because they hurt a civilian, sometimes because they failed to protect a buddy. And those are the kinds of decisions that end up haunting guys for years. So that's what we were training to do in preparation for our coming deployment to Iraq. And it was all kind of predicated on this distinction between good guys and bad guys. And the way we would train this kind of combat is we would create these like mock villages or mock neighborhoods. So what we did, there was some old closed down apartment housing in California outside of the base in the San Bernardino area. And we actually took a platoon of Marines who were just returning from their deployment, dressed them up like Iraqis with the traditional, keffiyeh headscarf and the dishdasha long shirt. had them pretend to be Iraqis, and then we just ran scenarios. So, they would be in their little make-believe village, pretending to go about daily life, and then we would send a patrol through, and there'd be some kind of scenario. So, like maybe among all of these good guys, there's one bad guy who has like a weapons cache somewhere, and we got to get intelligence from the good guys, find the bad guy, arrest them, and extract them without any casualties to civilians, something like that. Or, we'll be patrolling through, and one of the bad guys will take a good guy hostage. So then we got to kill the bad guy, rescue the good guy, get that sort of thing. It was always these kinds of scenarios that we were training for. So, we'd go in through this patrol and we pretend to like smile and wave and try to be culturally sensitive, pretend to pass out Tootsie Rolls to little kids. Meanwhile, gathering intel and stuff like that. It's a very different kind of warfare from traditional combat. But then once we get to Iraq, we prepared for a scenario where Iraqis either love us or they hate us, and that it would be easy to identify who the good guys were and who the bad guys were. And that was just not the case at all. When we got there, it turns out there is a, I don't know, ordinary spectrum of attitudes. There was no clear divide between the good guys and the bad guys. I gotta say, for the most part, nobody really liked us. Nobody really wanted us there. But then there was a spectrum of like how unhappy they were with us being there. Um, and I didn't understand those reasons at the time. Iraqis were very well informed about all the changes that we were making in their country without their consent and the problems that this was creating for them. But all we had to go on was the news playing in the chow hall, which told us that we were liberating this country and bringing them freedom without really going into detail about the actual structural changes that we were making in their society. So we were very uninformed about why these Iraqis were upset with us. And then we'd go out into this village, and it was just not easy to make this distinction between good guys and bad guys. And in fact, I began to sense that, well, there was something wrong with our mission. I couldn't quite, put it into words. I wasn't, very well informed about what we were doing, the changes we were making in Iraq, what the mission was really about. I didn't understand those things at the time, and so I couldn't fully understand why they were upset with us. But it was clear that they were upset, and that was enough for like I was there to, kill bad guys and rescue good guys. I didn't like operating in this morally gray area. I didn't want to impose anything on anyone. And this became pretty clear. There was this one incident. We were just kind of like patrolling through these villages, and we came across this guy's farm, and somebody found some rusty landmine in his backyard. It's very possible that thing was left over from the Iran-Iraq war. It did not look operable. I mean, there's all kinds of potential explanations of how that got there. Could have been left there for years. It could have been put there without his knowledge. Maybe somebody thought they were going to salvage the actual explosive material in it somehow. I don't know. The point is, excuse me, it became clear to me in that moment that we are literally in this guy's backyard and we had all the power. This guy had none. We arrested him. We threw sandbag on his head, flexi cuffs on his wrist, threw him in the back of the Humvee. The whole village came out protesting, saying he was a good guy. He would never hurt anybody. Um, but it didn't matter. They had no say. This guy was going to go to a military prison. We were going to bring him to Abu Ghraib, where there was just an awful torture scandal just a month earlier. He was not going to get a jury of his peers. He was not even going to get an Iraqi judge. He was going to go before a military tribunal, and they would decide his fate. And he might spend, 6 months to 6 years in a U.S. military detention facility in his own country. So in that moment, it became very clear to me why Iraqis were upset with the situation. They had foreigners in their country dictating their entire lives to them. So I started to understand if I was in their situation, if I was in their shoes, would I be picking up a gun and fighting against the American soldiers? I think if the situation was reversed, I think their motives would be very relatable to most Americans. So this is early on in my deployment. I already started to feel uncomfortable with what we were doing. This wasn't the way the mission was presented to me. I didn't like operating in this morally gray zone. As our deployment continued, more things happened that just made me feel more and more uncomfortable with what we were doing. There was one incident we were like patrolling down um, some villages in Haditha, and there was an IED. This kid from Boston got his leg blown off, but then everybody just started panicking and freaking out and just firing in all directions, just firing vaguely into this neighborhood across the river. A neighborhood that was full of civilians, and we were just also freaked out by what just happened. Like it was just like chaos. And civilians were killed. And like there continued to be incidences like this where, we made mistakes and people paid for it with their lives. So it was harder and harder for me to sustain this illusion that, we're liberating these people and we're bringing them freedom and democracy and we're doing a good thing. Um, I don't think, I mean, if other people had the doubts that I had, they kept it to themselves and they stayed quiet about it. I wish I had the courage and integrity to have taken a stand and said then that I don't feel comfortable with this anymore. I don't like what we're doing. I'm not proud of what we're doing. I don't think we're doing the right thing. But like I said, I was very underinformed. I didn't think I could say this in a way that anybody would take seriously. I thought I was probably going to get laughed at and then just basically be harassed for the duration of the deployment. Um, so I did the cowardly thing and I just kind of went through the motions day to day, even though I wasn't happy with what we were doing. I participated and just kept my mouth shut. I didn't always keep my mouth shut. I started getting in a lot of trouble because I was getting angry about what we were doing. But that's the extent of it. I limited it to gripes and complaints and, just being a smartass, basically. I took no real, I don't know, actual measures to make a stand or to stand my ground and stand up for what I believed in. And this continued all the way to Fallujah in November of 2004 for what they call the Second Battle of Fallujah. In my own writing, I argue it is more properly a siege. It was siege warfare. We completely surrounded the city, um, carpet bombed it for about a week, and then swept through with about 10,000 American troops. Fallujah is a large city, roughly 300 to 400,000 people. It was said that, and this was misinformation. This was coming from a psychological operation at the time. And if anyone's curious, I can tell you more about how US military propaganda works. They call it information operations, and psychological operation is one tool that they use for information operations. But they spread this lie that Fallujah had been somehow taken over or captured by Al-Qaeda. In about 2000, Al-Qaeda terrorists were holding the city hostage, and that we were going to come in and liberate the city. Um, that was not the case. I would say about 90 to 95% of the people we were fighting in Fallujah were local Fallujans who simply saw themselves as defending their country against a foreign invading, occupying army. Um, they weren't religious extremists, they weren't political extremists, they were pretty comparable to American Republicans. They were religiously conservative, loved their guns, they were nationalists, and just saw themselves as defending their country. Um, So the reasons we were given for this operation were largely false, but it led us to believe that we were fighting this like fundamentally evil enemy. They also led us to believe that the city was completely empty, that all the civilians had left, and that the only people left in the city were committed Al Qaeda terrorists. And they told us we didn't have to worry about collateral damage. And that wasn't the case at all. In fact, the Red Cross estimate, and our command knew this because the Red Cross had issued an estimate of at least 50,000 civilians still in the city. And it's very likely that that was a lowball figure. Um, so after about a week of aerial bombardment, not precision. I mean, we were dropping 500-pound bombs on residential neighborhoods. Those are not precision weapons. We bombed the city with white phosphorus. It is arguably a form of carpet bombing. And then we came in with 10,000 troops and swept from the northern edge of the city, house by house, southward. And it took about a month to get through and then back sweep and then open up the city again to the refugees who had left the city. Um, but in the course of the operation, I mean, this was heavy urban combat. People have argued that this was the bloodiest single operation of the
Yeah.
entire occupation period. Things got really crazy really quickly, and I watched it change people. I watched our level of comfort with bending the rules and breaking the rules increase day by day. It started with something called reconnaissance by fire, which is, if you don't know who might be in a house, fire into it first, listen. If you hear, I don't know, moaning or scurrying in the house, then there's probably somebody in there, and in which case we would probably just bulldoze it. We were, patrolling down city blocks with bulldozers and tanks, and if we suspected anyone in a house, we first assumed that they were insurgents, and we would either bulldoze it to the ground or we would fire a tank main gun round into it and just level the house. Or I've seen people level a house with a grenade launcher, a Mark 19 grenade. You just fire 20 grenades into it until the whole thing implodes on itself. Um, so I mean that's a violation of the Geneva Conventions. That's not distinguishing between civilian and combatant targets. But we got comfortable with that very quickly. We got comfortable with looting very quickly. We were going through homes and there was like a lot of fancy like silverware on the bodies of the fighters. A lot of them had international currencies, fancy weapons and stuff like that. So people started picking the pockets of the dead bodies. It got really gruesome really quickly, and I'll spare you all the details. But it went on like this for several weeks, and it got worse and worse. Eventually, there was sort of like a half-assed command to stop looting. But the whole time, our command assured us that, if we ever found ourselves in a legal situation where we were being accused of doing something wrong, that they would protect us, that we had, unit lawyers who were there to defend us in case of, charges of war crimes or something like that. So we were assured that we were doing the right thing and that we would be protected even if somebody accused us of doing the wrong thing. And we were assured that there wouldn't be any civilians in the city, so we were acting recklessly. And all said and done, there's only been one estimate of the potential civilian dead, and it looks like between 4 and 6,000 civilians were killed. Um, and because of the weapons we were using, we used a lot of depleted uranium. There's been a really severe public health crisis in the city ever since. Because that level of radiation was absorbed into people's bodies, and it's measurable. A friend of mine did a study recently. She collected bone samples from people in Fallujah, samples of like bone marrow and stuff like that, and they have high levels of uranium in their body from the depleted uranium, and the rates of babies being born with birth defects are the highest ever recorded in human history. This was a clip from a documentary film I made back in 2014, I think. But this came after doing a period of activism where I was trying to, raise awareness about what happened in Fallujah, set the record straight. Fallujah was probably the most heavily propagandized operation of the entire occupation period. So, has anybody seen the film? Excuse me, American Sniper? Yeah. So there's a big battle scene where the American sniper guy becomes famous as a sniper, and that's the second siege of Fallujah. That's the operation I'm telling about. The story they tell is what I told you earlier. The city was taken over by Al-Qaeda terrorists, and then the Americans show up and liberate the city. So that's the narrative that I'm trying to challenge when, I go out and I try to set the record straight on Fallujah and tell people what actually happened, what the actual reasons were for the operation. But this is the memory of Fallujah that has lived on in pop culture. And, when you hear politicians talking about Iraq, this is the story that they're usually telling. And it all comes from the propaganda operations that were going on at that time. Um, so I was trying to have these conversations with people. I was trying to raise awareness about it. And it's obviously, uncomfortable. It's an uncomfortable topic. It's difficult to talk about. A lot of people have different levels of background knowledge. So, this documentary was an attempt to sort of make it a little bit more digestible to people. And this footage comes from the Fallujah General Hospital, who requested that I include this footage because they felt like it was really unfair that Americans show up to their city, do this, and then they have to live with the consequences and we don't. They wanted us to at least have to see the consequences of what we did. And they felt abandoned. We did this in their city and then we weren't helping them with it. The Fallujah Hospital is very poor. They lack really just like basic materials. And they've been trying to raise awareness. Regularly, year after year, the rates are pretty stable. 14% of all babies born in Fallujah are born with these birth defects, highest rates ever recorded in human history. And nobody is helping them with this. So, and that's kind of the case with, not just the birth defects, but the reconstruction in the city. The city was leveled, completely leveled to the ground. City of, 300,000 people. They got like $200 to rebuild their homes. They literally got like a wheelbarrow with like a sack of rice, some cooking oil, and $200. That's what every family got from from the American Reconstruction teams following the up. It was really just um, sad, and they were really angry about it. So they wanted Americans to see this. They wanted them to hear about what happened to them because it's just our media did a terrible job informing the public about what was actually going on. So I guess I'll stop there. If you guys have questions. Yes, it does. Yes, it does. This is I'm trying to remember the exact words of what I heard somebody from my platoon say. I don't remember what prompted him to say this, but he was saying the question was coming from, I don't know, like his cousin or something like that, who was asking a similar kind of question to what you're asking. It was like, is it hard to kill somebody? And he's like, no, no. I mean, it was like shooting dogs, he said. And I can tell you about this other incident. So, if you go to boot camp, they make you shout kill a lot. Like you do one push up and you shout kill, do another push up, you shout kill. And they have this like ridiculous martial arts program where you throw a punch and you yell kill and you throw a punch and you yell kill. Um, and like I thought this was just like silly nonsense. Like there's no way that this is like actual psychological conditioning. Like there's no way this is like sinking into people's brains. But then, I was up on a roof with a radio, and platoon below us was patrolling down the street in Fallujah, and suddenly, I hear over the radio that there was contact, and the kid below us, who was also from Massachusetts, saw some guy standing there with something in his hands down the street a little bit, and he just reacted too quickly, pulled up his rifle real quick and fired. And the guy dropped, and the first words out of his mouth were "one shot, one kill." One of those things that they make us shout in boot camp. It was just like a reflex for him. Turns out it was an old man who had prayer beads in his hands, and when he got out of the military, he went into a long stretch of heroin addiction, and I think he's out of it now and he's doing better. But this eats him up. This really eats him up. But it was just like a reflex. Like he didn't even think about it. He just did it without thinking. So yeah, I think there are mechanisms in boot camp that make doing this easier. The dehumanization part of it makes it easier. If we actually knew who these guys were that we were fighting against, because they were telling us that these are Al-Qaeda fighters, that they're evil. They're not even Iraqi, that they came from other countries. And this was not the case at all. Al-Qaeda had a small presence in the city. There were like maybe 5, maybe 10%. They were not particularly well liked. Um, 90% of the people that we were fighting in Fallujah were people from Fallujah. And I actually met some of them in January. I did a little research trip. I was doing oral histories with a couple of colleagues. We met 3 guys who were former rebel fighters from Fallujah. We did a series of interviews. One dude was a farmer. One dude was a minister. And the other guy, he became a politician. I can't remember what he was before that. Ordinary, nice guys. We had a nice lunch before we did our interviews. We were just like joking and very comfortable with one another. And they didn't have any malicious intent. They didn't want to hurt anybody, but they felt a need to defend their city against foreign invaders. I think, if most Americans could, see it through their eyes, I think they would find their motives very relatable. But we didn't know that. We didn't know they were ordinary people who were just like Iraqi. They felt patriotic in the same way that we might feel patriotic, and they just wanted to defend their country in the same way that we might. We didn't know that. We thought these were like, twisted religious extremists that we were fighting. Um, so yeah, yeah, all of that misinformation, I think made it possible. Not just made it easy, made it possible. Oh, I don't know if there's a single moment. It was all pretty gradual. When we arrested that guy that I mentioned, that really made me think a lot. And then when I saw the way we reacted when, there was the IED and that kid lost his leg, the way we reacted, all our training went out the window. Everybody was just firing vaguely in the same direction. Um, that really gave me pause. And then Fallujah was such overkill. Like the destruction was just incredible. Like, this was a large city. And by the time we left, I didn't see a single building that didn't have, if it wasn't like completely just like rubbled, didn't have like major structural damage. Um, it was just incredible what we did to that city. So that, and then just like this story that we were liberating the city from Al Qaeda had so many holes in it. And just like I knew on some level that we were being lied to. I didn't know exactly what the lies were, but it just didn't make sense. So it was all accumulating. But I didn't really feel comfortable starting to speak out and to try to tell a different story until years later, after doing a lot of research, filling in the gaps in my own knowledge, understanding more why Iraqis were upset with us being there. I mean, yes, nobody wants their country invaded. And then in the course of the actual invasion phase, 6,000 Iraqis were killed through various, bombing campaigns until we captured Baghdad and actually overthrew the regime. So obviously, Iraqis were very upset about the way we invaded and then occupied their country. But we were making all kinds of permanent political changes to their country without their consent, just a foreign country showing up, making changes. Of course, people are going to be upset about that. So I didn't know that at the time. It took some research and some studying, and once I understood that this was just not vague anti-Americanism or religious extremism that was motivating people to fight against us, that they were pro-democracy, and we were just forcing a very limited, very meager kind of democracy on them, and they wanted something better than that. Once I felt confident that I could explain this to like an audience, then I stepped forward and I tried to take a public stance against this, but it took a long time and it was gradual. I went in 2 weeks after high school. I went to boot camp. So by the time I think I turned 20 in Iraq, yeah, 19, 20. I never had any authority. I got angry when we were in Iraq, and I started to get really lippy with my command, and just kind of I was just acting out, being a punk, honestly. I didn't have the courage or the integrity to really take a stand. So instead, I was just kind of like dragging my feet, talking back a lot. So I think I got promoted for like 2 weeks, and then I was demoted right back down. Um, But yeah, people's egos get out of control in the military. The rank structure really feeds right into it. In terms of what I've been talking about in Fallujah, with just like the violence getting out of control, I don't know that it's so much an authority thing as like a righteousness kind of thing, in that we felt like we had the moral high ground. I mean, these were evil people, we believed. So when we started doing things like picking the pockets of the dead, or in some cases, people were mutilating bodies. I mean, these were evil people. They were kind of beyond moral regard, right? So I think it was more about the way we dehumanized them and then justified our own mission through these like high moral principles, um, that made that sort of behavior seem permissible. But then also, I suppose there was an atmosphere of impunity also, just to add that. I was selfish and I lacked a backbone, and it took some effort to straighten that out a little bit. But I mean, my whole reason for going into the military was selfish. I mean, sure, I did want to defend my country. I did want to serve my country. But that was in the background. I got to be honest. At 18 years old, I just wanted to go have adventures, and I wanted girls to like me, and I wanted, men to shake my hand and offer me a free beer and all that kind of stuff. Um, I had selfish motives in mind. And then once I got there and I realized the problem, it took way too long for me to actually like take a stand and say like, no, this is what I believe. Um, but it was a learning experience, no doubt. It changed me as a person. It opened my eyes to a lot about the world. I had a very insular childhood. I was kind of, my hometown was my bubble. I didn't know much about what was going on in the world. But after this experience, I made it a point to educate myself about this kind of stuff, to learn more about the war itself, the world in general, American history, particularly our military history. So yeah, it was a transformational experience, and what it showed me about myself wasn't always good. If you go to a recruiter, they I think they do a lot to make you feel comfortable with these self-interested motives. So, they reassure you you're going to be defending your country, you're going to be doing a service to your country, you're defending freedom and democracy around the world. These are kind of like the go-to kind of platitudes they throw at you. Um, but then, there's the GI Bill for college. There's, what this will do for you on the job market afterwards. Being a veteran, increases your chance of employment. Um, the salary, the benefits, all this kinds of stuff. So ultimately, they throw a lot of job benefits at you, and you make this calculation as if, joining the military were just a job like any other job, and you just kind of consider the relative benefits versus, the challenges of this particular career path. And I think it's really kind of a strange thing of American culture that we treat joining the military as if it were any other job without like unique moral considerations that go along with it. We kind of don't consider the possibility that we might be signing up to fight an unjust war. The Iraq War was, in fact, an illegal invasion. It was the crime of aggression. Um, but we don't really, we don't hear about that in the news. That's not really part of our political discourse. And nobody really considers it even a possibility that you might be joining the military in order to participate in something like conquest, right? We believe that if you join the military, you are automatically a hero, regardless of, the particular war that you participate in. So it's this weird sort of cultural blind spot that we have for the military. And I didn't think twice about it. Never crossed my mind that I might end up fighting an unjust war, and I might end up being ordered to impose things on people that they didn't want, did not cross my mind. Yeah, yeah, I think it's harder. So you gotta, Fallujah was pretty crazy. It was a wild experience. And when we came back, I don't know, it's like when you're exposed to adrenaline is a drug, and you have withdrawals. So when we came back, we were thrill seeking. We were just out of control. The amount of drugs and alcohol in the barracks when we first came back from Iraq was just unchecked. And like every weekend we're going out into town and there were just, bar fights, DUIs, car crashes, all kinds of crazy stuff going on. And then things got so out of control, our command hit us with a surprise drug test one weekend, and half of the company failed. Because it was, I mean, you can't just lose half of a company. That's, of 150 people, you can't kick 75 people out of a military company, because they were trying to deploy back to Iraq. Um, So they made some deals, some guys with combat experience and otherwise uncheckered records, they let stay in the military and they kicked out probably 40. But imagine, all these guys that went to Fallujah, had this incredibly traumatic experience, then got kicked out of the military. Now Fallujah is that one shiny experience they have in their life. They're not getting any military benefits now. They can't put on a job application that they're a veteran because they'd have to show that they got a bad conduct discharge. So like all the guys from my old unit, like they are so intensely proud of Fallujah. It is like the one thing that they can really feel good about, the story that we liberated the city from Al Qaeda, biggest battle of the Iraq War. But if you take that away from them, it's a tough pill to swallow because then they really have nothing. So a lot of guys from my old unit, they see, that I speak publicly about this and I write publicly about this, and they're not happy with me about it. I get it. They say I'm spitting on the graves of the guys who died. They say that like I'm sympathizing with the terrorists and all this kinds of stuff. I mean, it's obviously these are bullshit excuses because it's just hard for them to question the assumptions that they had going into this, to think that maybe we weren't the good guys, maybe we were actually, doing harm, I think just adds a layer of distress when they're already, dealing with PTSD and addiction and all this other stuff. So yeah, so I think to think about these kinds of questions, it's difficult. It's particularly difficult for, veterans who were involved and they had this like traumatic combat experience. Then to question that, to question the justifications for everything you did, makes it even more difficult, I think. And this was something I knew nothing about while I was in the military. So I did not realize we have an international order. And for any country to engage in military action, you're supposed to go to the UN Security Council for authorization. And really, only in the context of self-defense, when you're being actually attacked by another country, will you be authorized for military action, strictly for defensive purposes only, according to the UN Charter, and also backed up by the Geneva Conventions. But the administration of George W. Bush was making a very controversial argument to justify going to Iraq because Iraq wasn't going to attack us. They were not involved in the attacks of 9/11 at all. Iraq didn't have a navy. They didn't have an air force. They weren't going to cross the Atlantic Ocean and come to the United States. They were not a military threat to us. So they had to make a controversial argument that we needed to go to war with Iraq preemptively because they might be a threat to us someday. And the might was, in the context of international terrorism, a dictator like Saddam Hussein, who had a grudge against us for, I won't get into that history, um, that he might pass weapons of mass destruction to a terrorist organization, or they might work together in some way to launch a 9/11-like attack against the United States. But this idea of preemptive war had been thoroughly delegitimized within the international system ever since World War II because of people like Hitler, who always claim, he invaded Czechoslovakia because Czechoslovakia was like an arrow pointing at the heart of Germany, and they were going to be a threat someday. Poland was going to be a threat to Germany someday, so they needed to invade Poland too. If you legitimize this concept of a preemptive strike, you open the door to every would-be conqueror the world over. So it's just not an acceptable line of reasoning within this international system we had. But the Bush administration was trying to rehabilitate this idea of preemptive war, saying we needed to strike Iraq before they got a chance to pass weapons of mass destruction, which they didn't have, by the way. That was also part of the propaganda. We went to the UN Security Council, requested authorization for military action, and did not get it. They didn't buy this preemptive story that we were trying to sell them. And we invaded anyways, without authorization, which technically is the crime of aggression. And the crime of aggression is slightly different from other war crimes in that everything that follows is also a war crime. If you don't have a legitimate cause for starting a war, the war doesn't then become legitimate after the initial invasion. It continues to be illegitimate. So every single patrol, every single operation for the entire duration of the occupation of Iraq was illegal. There always needs to be military necessity. There cannot be a legitimate military action without military necessity. And there was just no military necessity in Fallujah. So on that grounds alone, Fallujah was also a war crime because it was part of an illegitimate war, a war crime because this operation itself had no military necessity. Um, for other reasons too. So I mentioned some particular tactics like reconnaissance by fire, which is a failure to distinguish between civilian and military targets. So some of the tactics we were using were also war crimes. But then also, this was actually reported in the news, although it didn't get a lot of cover. There were peace talks between some of the political and military leadership in Fallujah and American forces um, before the second siege. So the rebel fighters in Fallujah agreed that they would lay down their heavy weapons and they would allow the US military into the city to start conducting patrols and allow them to have a security presence in the city in order to avoid a large-scale operation. They made one demand that the US military acknowledge that civilians had been killed in the airstrikes, and it was very well documented that civilians had been killed. But the US military refused to acknowledge that, and they made a stipulation of their own that they turn over Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, who allegedly was the leader of Al-Qaeda in Iraq. Um, and he was the central focus of a psychological operation being conducted by the US military, claiming that he was in Fallujah and recruiting an army of terrorists to launch attacks all across Iraq. Zero evidence that this guy ever set foot in Fallujah. There was zero evidence. They just claimed it and then demanded that they turn him over as a pretext, as a condition for avoiding the operation. So it was really just a way of dismissing the peace talks. So also, this is a war crime because this was an easily avoidable military operation. Like much of what we claimed we wanted to achieve, pacifying Fallujah, could have been achieved through diplomatic means. But instead, we insisted on going forward with a military operation and there's a reason for that too. I don't want to keep going, but I can give like a broader history of the sequence of from the first siege of Fallujah to the second siege of Fallujah. I feel like the decision to not participate should have been made before the operation started. Once you're in it, survival overrode everything else. Um, so we didn't see that many civilians. I don't know where they were hiding. I mean, they were definitely in the city. There was that one incident I told you about where my friend shot a civilian. There was another where we saw a small cluster of them. But apart from that, as we're doing reconnaissance by fire, we didn't believe we were putting anybody in danger, and we just saw it as a measure to be safer ourselves. Because the most dangerous thing for us was kicking down the door of a house, and there would be guerrilla fighters inside, sandbags already set up with machine guns aimed in on the door. And the second that door opens, they pull the trigger. And we lost a lot of guys like that. So for us, the best way we could stay safe was through measures like reconnaissance by fire, which never should have happened. We just shouldn't have been in that situation in the first place. But once you're in it, like I think it's too much to ask ordinary soldiers to see the problem with that kind of tactic when their lives are at stake. There was another, and this was an awful situation, but there were a few Al-Qaeda. So, all right, this is a more complicated history of what's going on. And this is based on some of the interview material that I collected in January. Most of the local fighters in Fallujah knew this was a losing battle. And but they stayed in the city and they hunkered down and they fought. For the most part, there was a small contingent of these international jihadists who were not well liked in Fallujah. They knew that these guys were crazy, but they had bigger problems fighting the Americans. So, like, they weren't focused on fighting Al Qaeda. But Al Qaeda mostly fled. Mostly, we did find a few bodies that looked like they could have been international fighters because they had international currencies on them and stuff like that. But for the most part, we were finding um, the bodies of local fighters, people who were from Fallujah. But this incident was most likely, um, I think, must have been an international person, probably with some sort of extremist ideology, who had two children with him in a house. And by our eyes, it looked like he was using the kids as human shields. I don't know if he saw himself as protecting those kids from us. I don't know. I don't really know how to explain that scenario. But the decision we were faced with was either send guys into the house to try to extract these kids and most likely get shot up in the process, or collapse that building down on top of all of them. And that's what we did. And a lot of people felt uncomfortable with that, rightly so. But then nobody wanted to volunteer to be the first person in the door either. So I just feel like to answer your question, I think the decision to either participate or not participate was before the operation started. Because once you're in it, I think you just got to prioritize your own safety and the safety of the people around you. That's a really hard question to answer. So I teach now. I teach writing to college freshmen. And occasionally, I bring my own my academic expertise is the history of the Iraq War. And occasionally I bring my expertise in for like particular themed writing assignments or something like that. And mostly what I'm seeing is that the youngest generation, my freshmen coming in, 19-year-old kids, really have no knowledge of the Iraq War at all. Um, and then my generation was so heavily propagandized about the Iraq War. Mostly what they know about the Iraq War is false, some sort of historical mythology that we mistakenly, based on intelligence failure, invaded Iraq because we thought they had weapons of mass destruction. But then we changed course and, helped them build a democracy. It was messy, but everything's okay now. That seems to be the story my generation has mostly internalized. And you can see that kind of like reproduced in pop culture. Like I said, that movie American Sniper treats all of this historical mythology as, as if it were fact, right? All these propaganda talking points end up, materializing themselves one way or another in the film. And you see it in a bunch of other films. I don't know what you guys might have seen. War Dogs with Jonah Hill. That one also, the Fallujah is kind of present in that one. Um, So I don't know. I'm not sure that we've really learned the lessons that we need to learn. And for me, what I guess if I could just like boil it down to a couple of things I wish the American public was a little bit more aware of, um, it's that we don't always fight wars for the right reasons. There is this like pervasive and like enduring myth that we fight wars for essentially high-minded purposes to promote democracy, to promote freedom, so on and so forth. I would make the controversial argument that this has never been the case. I know that that's somewhat of an unpopular opinion. I believe the US only fights wars of choice, has only ever fought wars of choice. So I would like Americans to be a little bit more skeptically minded about the purpose of our wars. And I want the American public to be aware that we do in fact have a propaganda apparatus in our country. In the military, they call it information operations, and they target domestic audience as well as enemy audiences equally. Um, at the level of government, they call it strategic communications. So the Bush administration, they had a strategic communications campaign, one, to convince the American public that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction. Two, to convince them that that there was a cell of Al-Qaeda guys in their country and that Saddam Hussein was somewhat friendly. It's true that there were some Al-Qaeda guys in Iraq, but Saddam Hussein was not friendly to them. Um, and three, that potentially Iraq could team up with these Al-Qaeda guys and launch another 9/11 type attack against us. And it turns out Saddam Hussein was like uh, monitoring all these Al-Qaeda guys, considered them a national security threat to his country too. So there was really no chance of any collaboration between them. Um, this was in 2003, and the propaganda has only gotten more sophisticated since, now with the presence of social media, in the way that they're able to just sort of saturate the information landscape with misleading narratives, biased uses of vocabulary, um, justifications out of context. I mean, I could give a few examples about the Iran war right now, but I feel like this is going to lead to a long history lesson about US-Iranian relations going back to, the CIA coup in 1954. It's a long conversation, but the point is, Americans are almost always underinformed about the international context in which these conflicts are taking place. So I would just like them to approach it with a little bit more of a skeptical mindset, one about the justifications for the war, the motives for the war, and the justifications being given to them.